Hello everyone, I'd like to begin today's video with a quote, and the quote comes from the IGN review of Resident Evil 4 Remake, and it states,
"I returned to the original game for the first time in years, and was shocked at how badly this remake was needed."
Go ahead and underline the word needed, because that is the key term and the linchpin to today's video, because today I'm not just talking about Resident Evil 4 Remake specifically, though I will talk about the game a lot. I'm also talking about this general mentality that I see all over the place on Reddit, on social media, and especially in mainstream game reviews, which is a mentality I would like to call remake culture. Everything needs a cool term these days, and that is my cool term, remake culture. And what remake culture is the belief that ever since video games first began with Pong or whatever the first game was, ever since that initial starting point, video game design has been on a perfect upward trajectory, constant forward progress. Year by year, game developers are getting smarter and more sophisticated. It's like Moore's Law, so that if a game came out in 1998, that's like Windows 98. And if a game comes out in 2023, that's like Windows 11. And there's just no competition. Games of the past, they are blueprints for the games of today. They had some ideas, they were doing some cool stuff, but for the most part, they are the stepping stones to the brilliant modern game design that we have now. So that even if a game came out in the recent past, like Resident Evil 4, and at that time it was considered a masterpiece in combat, controls, level design, presentation, just overall across the board a masterpiece, well, that's all cute for Resident Evil 4, but because of the passage of time, by natural accumulation, developers now are just going to be able to create a superior, better product, at least in terms of gameplay mechanics. And to support what I'm saying, here's another quote from IGN.
"Its controls have been modernized in order to allow its signature dynamic shooting mechanics to really shine."
Highlight modernized. That's going to be a running theme, not just through this IGN review, but in the comment section, on social media. People are going to say over and over again, just by plugging in modern generic third-person shooter mechanics, that inherently improves the design of Resident Evil 4. There is no way that the team that was making Resident Evil 4 created the restrictions that they did for any other purpose other than because it was in the past and they didn't understand modern game controls. They couldn't figure out the brilliance of double analog stick aiming. That had not been discovered yet. Even though in the original you can actually look around a little bit using the right analog stick, they were so close. Why couldn't they figure out that you could just aim with it? Why couldn't they figure that out? That's something that puzzles IGN, and the reviewer does express this concern in the next quote here, which is,
"The movement of main star Leon Kennedy felt ridiculously restricted. He struggles to get around as though he's wearing an old pair of skinny jeans that hadn't fit him since his police academy days, and is immobilized anytime he gets his gun out as though he's incapable of independent control over his hands and feet at the same time."
It's called punctuation, IGN.
"By modern standards, it's absurd, and would absolutely put off a lot of newcomers before they could even begin to understand why the game is so highly regarded."
There you go. In black and white, IGN actually described the controls of the original Resident Evil 4 as
absurd.
Again, it is not occurring to this reviewer at all that there was a purpose to the restriction of the controls and aiming of the original Resident Evil 4. That the fact that the camera is locked to Leon Kennedy's back and that he can't just run and shoot all day, maybe there's a reason for this restriction. Maybe by making Leon plant his feet when he shoots and that he can't see what exactly is behind him, maybe that creates some kind of risk-reward system with the gameplay, where the player is always wondering, what is behind me? And then with the sounds and you hear something creeping behind you, doesn't that create a little bit of anxiety? And maybe if you're alone in your room at 4 a.m. in the dark, maybe just a little bit of fear? Whereas now with the remake and its generic third-person aiming, you're never wondering what's behind you. You know what's behind you. You can just turn around and look. Not only that, you can just start aiming at all directions. You don't have that whole risk reward system of knocking an enemy down, but then also having to manage what's creeping up behind you and having to position yourself strategically in the room so that you're not getting attacked from behind. Yeah, that's not so much a factor anymore because you can just shoot and run as you go. It's not really a big deal anymore. So on behalf of the IGN guy, sure, you can say, well, I prefer the free aiming third-person shooter controls now because of this and that. But the fact that the IGN guy in his review, which is supposed to be the leading publication of game reviews, and he's given the game a perfect score, by the way, a 10 out of 10 perfect score, never even brings up the trade-off with the change in the camera system, never even brings up the implications this change makes to the level design and game design. Throughout this entire review, he's just saying over and over again, it's objectively better. It's just a better improvement. Why? I don't know, but it just is. Over and over, he's saying that. And we'll get to more quotes here in a bit. But getting back to the topic of remake culture, there's one other thing I want to talk about, and then we'll talk about the game specifically, which is the idea that not all remakes are the same. Not all remakes are created equal. And I think that's the tripping up point whenever we have discussions about remakes, because let's say Final Fantasy VII Remake comes out, or Resident Evil 4 Remake comes out, and you start to bring up objections like, well, does this make sense? Is this artistically a valid idea? And often what will happen is people will come in and say, well, this other remake came out and that totally works, so there you go, remakes are valid. Well, it depends on the situation. And unfortunately, when it comes to analyzing art, and I do consider video games art, and that is relevant to today's video, nuance must be applied. Because when it comes to remakes, it's basically the way developers view remakes versus the way I view remakes are completely opposite from one another. And I'll explain. So for me, what makes a valid remake? What makes a remake make sense and be something that is artistically worthwhile? Well, basically, you want your source material to be kind of obscure and to be kind of broken. That way, you have a goal and you can actually create something that is an improvement over the original game that you're trying to remake. A great example of this is Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge. So when Ninja Gaiden 3 came out, fans hated it, everyone hated it. It was a compromised piece of crap, no one liked it. Team Ninja were like, whoa, okay, we kind of abandoned everything that makes Ninja Gaiden awesome. Let's fix this. And so they went in and they redid the game and re-released it as Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge. Razor's Edge is a remake of Ninja Gaiden 3 with the intended purpose to replace and improve the original game. No one buys Razor's Edge and then says, oh man, but to really round out my collection, I need to go buy Ninja Gaiden 3. No, Razor's Edge replaces Ninja Gaiden 3. It is the improvement. It is the definitive version. You can take your copy of Ninja Gaiden 3 and you can throw it in the garbage. That is not the case with Resident Evil 4 Remake or Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that's not even the sales pitch. That would be insane and kind of interesting if it was, but Capcom or Square, when they're announcing these remakes, are not coming out and saying, yeah, Final Fantasy VII, go ahead and throw away your PlayStations because the remake is going to absolutely replace the original. But in my opinion, that would be the most valid goal of a remake. The most artistically valid way to remake something is with the intention to replace it, to improve it so much that the original version is just garbage. But that's not remake culture. What remake culture is that developers look at a game that's already well made, that's already popular, that already has a built-in fan base, and they remake the game by creating an alternative fan fiction version of the original. And that is essentially what these remakes are. Resident Evil 4 Remake is a fan fiction version of Resident Evil 4, just like Final Fantasy VII Remake is a fan fiction version of Final Fantasy VII. And if you look at these remakes from that context, everything makes way more sense. That's why fans are so receptive to these remakes, and why in the comment section people will say stuff like, well, you still always have the original, there's always the original, so what's it really matter if this remake is not faithful to it at all? Well, the problem with that is a little something called artistic integrity, because if you remove artistic integrity from this situation, it's a win-win for everyone. A remake is a win-win for the developers because developers don't have to conceive an entirely new game and take that risk. They already have a built-in fan base. Not only do they have an already built-in fan base, but they also have a big fat blueprint to just follow along and sort of just ride along the coattails of. So when they're making Resident Evil 4 Remake, they already have level design built in, boss fights built in, concepts built in, storylines to follow. And what they do is, like a fan fiction, they just kind of skim across the top and change a few things here and there. Oh, that dog that was originally going to be set free at the start, we're going to have it be dead, but psych, it's not actually dead. We're just going to move it somewhere else to trick you because isn't that fun? And there's all kinds of dumb crap like that because remakes need to justify themselves in some stupid fashion. And that's why people are constantly saying, oh, Resident Evil 4 Remake is the perfect remake. It's different enough to not be faithful to the original game at all, but it's also similar enough to sort of taste like the original game and to follow the beats of the original game. And isn't that just pleasant from everyone? No one's taking risks. No one's surprised. Everyone's playing it safe here. The developers are playing it safe because they're following the formula and just changing a few elements here or there to modernized audiences. And then fans, they're not taking risks either. You don't have to say, oh, am I going to buy the game? Am I going to like the game? I like Resident Evil 4, and I know it's going to kind of take a bunch of elements from Resident Evil 4, so I'll jump in on that as well. And everyone's happy, except in the back of the players' minds, in the back of the developers' minds, there's this quiet, unspoken truth, which is, yeah, but if we're being real here, this is just a cash-in. This is not a legitimate artistic effort. Because if it was a legitimate artistic effort, you would not see videos coming out and speculating, what does Capcom do next? Do they remake Resident Evil 5? Do they remake Resident Evil 6? Because if this was a legitimate artistic effort, Resident Evil 6 would be like the first game they'd remake. Resident Evil 6 in the catalog of Resident Evil games is like the one that needs remaking the most. That would make the most sense artistically. Financially, not so much. How many people are going to be doing backflips for a Resident Evil 6 remake? Probably not all that many. And then the amount of effort and time and work it would take to remake that behemoth and make it something manageable and something good would be years and years of work. And so I'd be surprised. They might go on and remake 5, which I think would be kind of funny. But I think it's actually more likely they're going to remake Resident Evil 1 Remake. Or they might start setting their sights on other lucrative properties to remake, like Devil May Cry. And that will be quite a day when we see the Devil May Cry remake announced. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that happening. But when it comes to this whole remaking culture, I think its whole premise is absolutely flawed because I think it's complete bullshit to think that game design has just been on this linear upward trajectory. I know journalists tend to think that, but in my opinion, we have lost just as much as we have gained. In fact, over the past few years, I think we're losing more insights on game development than gaining them, especially with mainstream AAA games, because there was a time when mainstream AAA games, Resident Evil 4, were raised and bred in the arcade environment. And what that meant is they had a really, really strong grasp on the fundamentals of game design and on gameplay mechanics and on combat. They knew hitboxes, hitstun, level design, enemy design, the fundamentals of what makes a game feel good. But now millennial game designers, that bullshit. We're so smart and clever. What we're going to do is we're going to have these really intellectual styles of gameplay. So instead of making a combat system where you have a roundhouse kick, and then you have to really carefully balance how big that roundhouse kick is, how big that hitbox is, how far is the range, how much hitstun does that do, how long is the enemy knocked down. Instead of sitting and playtesting all that dumb bullshit, instead what we're going to do is we're so smart, we're just going to give everything special states and everything's going to be nice and prescribed so that when something comes at you, you parry it. You don't need to worry about how far away it is or moving out of the way. You just parry it out of the way. And then when it comes to the hitboxes of the grabs, instead of having to move around and outspace the grab, and instead of sitting down and programming out how much distance does the grab have, how fast can the enemy move, how much tracking does this attack do, instead it's just simply just press duck. So grabs will track you from across the world, enemies will hunt you down from across the stage, but you deal with them through special states of parrying or ducking, instead of having to outspace them or outmove them like in the original. And I have this whole video, by the way, talking about the gameplay changes and the mechanical changes and why I think they're absolutely lame in the remake, so I won't go on and on about that in this video. But returning to my original point, I think the quality of game design is like the stock market. It goes in spikes and waves. And when Resident Evil 4 came out, that PS2 era, we were in a spike. We were in some of the best games of all time being created. Resident Evil 4, Metal Gear Solid 3 are two ones that quickly come to mind, because that era was the era when all these brilliant, seasoned, experienced, arcade-bred developers in Japan were reaching the peak of their skills, and the fundamentals were still there. They were exploring concepts that we start to see in mainstream gaming, like leveling systems, RPG mechanics, exploration, quick time events, all that kind of crap. They were exploring that stuff, but they were still very tied to the fundamentals of the game design. I think we're honestly losing that day by day, and that the new crop of Japanese developers do not have that same skill set as their predecessors. And there's no better example of this contrast than Resident Evil 4 versus Resident Evil 4 Remake. So let's talk about it.
Got something that might interest you. Got a selection of good things on sale, stranger.
When it comes to Resident Evil 4 Remake, all the complaints I made in the previous video about its combat design have held up throughout the game. So again, I recommend you watch my previous video where I talk about the changes in the enemy design and the combat mechanics. So what I want to talk about now are the overall changes to the level design and composition of the game. So let's return to our IGN article.
Enjoyably fluid without compromising any of the challenge when played on the hardcore setting recommended for returning players.
Enjoyably fluid, I think, is an incredibly over-generous description of the combat of Resident Evil 4 Remake. And in fact, I'd say it's quite clunky and awkward for two main reasons. The first reason is the way Leon controls in this game. So, like the IGN guy complained about in the original game, Leon did have some restrictions when it came to his movement and shooting in the original. In the original, Leon could not shoot and move at the same time. He had to plant his feet to shoot, and we talked about why that was in the previous video. And the other thing he couldn't do is he couldn't run sideways and strafe. So the way you had to play the original was a little bit more strategic with the direction of your movement. That being said, once you understand the rules of the original's movement system, you understand how the game wants you to move, you have full and precise control over Leon, and he is actually very responsive and very snappy. Once you understand I can't run sideways or I can't run and shoot at the same time, once you understand those restrictions, you can play incredibly reliably within those restrictions. On the other hand, Leon in the remake, while on paper he can run sideways and he can run and shoot at the same time, you would say, oh, he's very unrestricted. Well, what the developers have decided to do is add in this really awkward and strange artificial restriction to Leon. So now when he runs, he has this weird sort of delay or inertia. He doesn't have precision in his movement. There's this heaviness, awkwardness to it where you're never quite fully in control of Leon's movement. And then on top of that, there is his aiming. So in the original, sure, you couldn't run and shoot at the same time, but once you planted your feet, you had very precise shots with the original. Even with the pistol, you could shoot stuff from across the screen with this tiny little pistol. Well, in the remake, there's a lot of gun sway and there's a lot of imprecision with your aiming in terms of actually lining up and firing. So what does that mean? That means that the controls in the original, while somewhat constricted, are 100% reliable within that restriction. Whereas the controls in the remake are less restricted on paper, but they are way less reliable. And you know what that means? They are way more frustrating because let's say you have a scenario in the original that you route out, you can execute that route with precision every single time. Once you understand, I'm going to move here, I'm going to stop, I'm going to shoot, you're going to move, stop, and shoot every time the exact same way, and it's going to work out pretty much the exact same way every single time. In the remake, let's say you come up with the route, run here, I'm going to turn around, I'm going to walk backwards and shoot. Well, you're going to do that, but each time you try, you're going to have all this weird variation in, okay, you stopped here, but Leon kept moving because of inertia, or you tried to begin running here, but it had that delay, so it's not working out the same way. And then you go to aim and fire, but Leon's built-in gun sway and his built-in imprecision of shots, maybe you hit it, maybe you don't. And it's just not going to be all that reliable. And what that's going to mean is that in higher difficulty runs, in higher difficulty gameplay, it's actually going to be much more frustrating of an experience. Sure, in short bursts, it can be immersive to have a bunch of gun sway and imprecise aiming and sludgy controls. And oh, that's just part of the balance of the game. And you know what also doesn't feel good? The loss of hitstun in this game, where zombies bum rush you, and they also just tank bullets, especially in higher difficulties. So what does this lead to? It leads to a style of gameplay where you're constantly running around, strafing and shooting, and none of it feels good. Whereas in the original Resident Evil 4, hitting enemies and stunning them feels good. Having an impact on the game feels good. Being able to reliably control your gun, guess what? It feels good. Players like to have control over the game. And that leads us to my second big critique of the remake's gameplay, which is that it feels completely disjointed. It is a bunch of individual ideas thrown into a pile. It is not a cohesive vision, a cohesive whole of a gameplay experience. It has all these different individual elements pulled from all these different sources. Then they're just kind of thrown into a blender. This is millennial game design. And that is your game. So we've got a parry. Why is there a parry? Because parries are in. Does it make sense that Resident Evil 4 would have a parry? It really doesn't, but parries are in, so it's got a parry. What is Leon gonna parry with? His knife, I guess. Even though it looks absolutely absurd in most cases, especially when he's parrying a chainsaw, but that's what he's got, so he's parrying with his knife. Oh, well, it turns out parrying is really, really good. So what do we do about that? The knife breaks. Okay, so the knife breaks. So how do we deal with that? Well, I guess you have to repair the knife every time you go to the merchant. And not only that, you have to upgrade the knife so you can keep this mechanic going. Even if it cuts into all the other aspects of the leveling system, it doesn't matter. Repair that knife. Knife durability is the name of the game. Okay, so we've got a parry. What else do we got? Well, we've got ducking and stealth mechanics. Why would Leon have stealth mechanics? Well, because Last of Us has stealth mechanics. All games now have stealth mechanics, so how does that fit into the level design of Resident Evil 4? It really doesn't, but we're gonna add it in anyway. So now he's got stealth mechanics. But what about the shooting mechanics? Are we gonna retain the original shooting mechanics? No, we'll put in just generic third-person shooting mechanics, and let's throw in some gun sway for the hell of it, because Last of Us has gun sway. We already took the stealth system from Last of Us, so let's add in the gun sway as well. But then for the Resident Evil 4 fans, let's go ahead and keep the roundhouse kick and the suplex, but really shrink their hitboxes and not give them any iframes, which makes them massive liabilities, because they'll do a roundhouse kick, and then as you're coming out of the roundhouse kick, someone will throw a grenade at you and kill you. So what is the final feel of Resident Evil 4 Remake? To me, it feels like a mishmash of a bunch of other popular games out right now. It doesn't stand out to me in any sort of way. If it wasn't named Resident Evil 4 Remake, I wouldn't care about it. I wouldn't worry about it. It's not particularly bad. It's not particularly good. But the idea that it is somehow an improvement upon the original Resident Evil 4 is laughably absurd, in my opinion. And the only reason why I think IGN gets away with a claim like this is because people are locked into this whole remake concept, and also because people don't care about gameplay mechanics all that much, which is sad, but true, because when we talk about these remakes, I would have more traction complaining about how they changed Ashley's skirt, or her personality, or her boobs, or I talked about changes to the story and all that kind of thing. That would have more traction, or anything political, of course. That would have more traction than if I complain about the fact that they ripped out the entire core gameplay system and then shoved in this crappy generic gameplay system, and then had the audacity to be like, we remade it, and then IGN have the audacity to say, it's improved. That doesn't really connect with people. People really don't care about that stuff nearly as much as story or politics or whatever. which is sad, but that is the language people talk about to discuss and review games. So with that being said, let's continue with another quote from IGN, which says,
"Its pacing has been tightened to the point where hardly a single minute is wasted."
its pacing has been tightened. So IGN is making the claim that the pace of the remake is faster than the pace of the original Resident Evil 4. That is just completely inaccurate and untrue. That is one of these critiques where you could say that is not correct. There is no way the pace of the remake is tighter than the pace of the original Resident Evil 4. There's no way you can make that claim and then follow up to say,
"But now you can fully explore the lake and its surroundings by boat, docking at various inlets to scour cabins and caves for additional puzzles, valuable treasures, and hidden horrors lying in wait."
So let me get this straight. Resident Evil 4 Remake's pace is tighter, but it also has more side quests and exploration. That does not compute. And of course, the way it works, like with all remakes, is that Capcom have taken the level design of Resident Evil 4 and stretched it out. So now when you go to the lake, you gotta drive to all these different islands and solve all these little side quests on the islands. And then when you get to the boat for the first time, turns out the boat doesn't have fuel, so you have to do a side quest to find the fuel. And then constantly throughout the game, you're finding gears and levers and keys, because what the developers are trying to do is wedge in extra content into the structure of the already existing game that is Resident Evil 4. And I think it's pretty clear that initially the devs were planning on greatly expanding the game overall, because the early game is full of all these extra sections like the lakeside quests. But like a TV show that blows its entire budget in the first few episodes, later on the dev team seems to have run into some kind of time crunch because they started cutting sections of the game like the U3 fight and the underground sand village. The team were clearly not able or willing to make as many unique areas, so they ended up stretching out existing areas to try and make up for the lost sections. This isn't a tighter campaign, it's a lopsided one. The remake is trading out much better sections of the original for lame new ones. There's no way to claim that the pace of the remake is faster than the original. That's just untrue. And then on top of that, the environments are much more cluttered and confusing than the original. So much so that they had to add paint to everything just to guide the player along. There's so many random objects and random turns and corners and weirdly designed rooms that the developers gave up and just gave you yellow paint to guide you where to go or what boxes to open. And it's not a popular concept anymore, but there used to be a game journalism concept called ludonarrative dissonance, and the whole idea was that the gameplay elements of the game should line up with the story elements of the game. I think that idea is absolutely ridiculous for a number of reasons, and maybe I'll make a video about that in the future. But if we're talking ludonarrative dissonance, IGN, where does all this yellow paint come from? Who's painting this path for Leon or painting all the item crates for him? Is he getting strategic paint drops from the CIA guiding him along his path? I think it's pretty silly looking and absurd, especially compared to the original, which had a real nice, stark flow to it, which also made it much easier to navigate because the levels flowed along and you knew where to go in the rooms. In the remake, I'm constantly opening my map, trying to navigate where the hell I am going because the environments are so cluttered and confusing. And I want to end today's video by talking about the game's presentation, because I think a lot of people take for granted that because the remake is on a modern graphics engine, it just outright looks better than the original. But I think when it comes to art direction, the original is miles better than the remake. And honestly, I think the remake's visual presentation is pretty lame and generic, and I'm going to point out some specific examples of this. So first of all, there is the village. So the village in the original game had this really stark, empty, desolate, western ghost town feel to it that really was unnerving and eerie. Instead, what they went with the remake is that it's overgrown, cluttered, and bloody. And that's kind of the go-to plan for the remake, is whenever we want to make something scary, let's just make it cluttered, dark, and bloody. That'll do the trick. It doesn't look scary in the slightest. It also looks very generic. Like, I've seen this type of village 100 times before, whereas the original village, it has a very distinctive look and feel and color palette, and you know I am in the Resident Evil 4 village. Very iconic. So now let's go to what I think is the biggest monstrosity of the game, the castle. This was the point of the game where I was like, how is this game getting such wide praise? How is this game getting 10 out of 10 when they did such a horrible job with the castle? So the Resident Evil 4 castle, in my opinion, is one of the most iconic areas in all of gaming. It is absolutely incredible, and it is one of those areas in gaming where you could tell there is a real artistic direction, especially when the castle is mixed in with the game's camera system. So I talked about the importance of the camera system when it comes to the gameplay mechanics, but also with the game's presentation, the camera system is absolutely critical. And I'll explain why, but you're gonna have to follow me on this journey. So when Stanley Kubrick made his version of The Shining, one of the artistic decisions he made was, instead of doing the lame horror movie thing of making the hotel dark and spooky and shadowy and dingy, and at any minute something could pop out and scare you. Instead of doing that, what did Kubrick do? He created a sense of fear and suspense by making the hotel brightly lit, ornate, beautiful, and then using the camera work to create suspense. The difference is, in a typical horror movie, you are scared of what's in the shadows. You are scared of what could be popping out into the frame at any minute.
Ashley! What's going on?
But once that fear is revealed, it's just kind of, okay, there it is, that's where it was, let's move on. The Shining and also Eyes Wide Shut have a much more lasting, eerie type of suspense. The tension is created by the camera angle. You're not worried about what's in front of Danny. You're not worried what's around the corner. You're always wondering what's behind him. What is behind the camera? And the difference is that you can never solve that problem, because as soon as you turn around, you're just wondering, okay, but what's behind me now? And that is the exact way Resident Evil 4's camera system works. The suspense is never gone in Resident Evil 4 because there's always something possibly behind you. Even if you spend all day turning around, back and forth, there's just always that moment of, oh crap, is something behind me? Oh crap, is something behind me? And the game's enemy design and level design plays with that dynamic so well, especially in the castle. There's so many points in the castle where you'll just be walking and you'll just turn. You'll just turn around. Even though you just walk down that hall, you'll turn around right behind you. You're always wondering, wait, is something behind me? Is something behind me? Is something behind me? It's the way the camera system creates that effect. And what's also beautiful about it is the art direction of the castle complements that. It is brightly lit. It is beautiful. It is ornate. It is creepy. And yet something's off. Something is wrong, but that wrongness is subtle and disturbing. So what did they do with the remake? They turned it into a Saturday morning cartoon. They turned it into a generic horror show, just like how there's the Kubrick version of The Shining, which is an enduring masterpiece. There's also this made-for-TV version of The Shining, which has the dark rooms and the cobwebs and the things that jump out at you. And that's the version of Resident Evil 4 we have now. It's the made-for-TV version, where now the castle is dark and spooky and bloody, and it looks like Diablo and looks like every other game. And then on top of that, since they removed the camera system, they can't do that whole game of what's behind you. So now they have to change the rooms into that stupid generic, oh, it's a tiny little hallway. Then they have to turn out the light and make you use a flashlight like Doom 3, because they didn't have the artistic insight to understand the beauty of the castle's original design, and the fact that it is brightly lit and ornate is part of that. Instead, they just add shadows and smoke and red light and blood and writing on the walls, and oh, isn't that so scary? They took something truly unique and brilliant, and they turned it generic and lame. And that is the story of Resident Evil 4 Remake. It can get every single review outlet on the world to give it a 10 out of 10. It can get every single person on Twitter to claim it's better than the original. It can get 100 people in the comment section saying I'm crazy. But at the end of the day, I do not respect this remake. I think it is a massive step down compared to the original. I think it is
lame.
How no other mainstream reviewer had the balls to critique this remake, and everyone is jumping on this bandwagon saying it's a 10 out of 10 masterpiece. I cannot disagree anymore. Gameplay wise, generic and lame. Visually, generic and lame. It has none of the brilliance or artistic integrity of the original. It is Capcom just cashing in. And you know what? It is what it is. They probably don't have the talent, honestly, to create something that is close to the caliber of the original Resident Evil 4. So the best they can do is just remake it. But the part about it that I think is really lame is how critics and reviewers have just swallowed it up wholesale. 10 out of 10. Better than the original. I think that is absurd. And I think it is only fitting to finish today's video with another final quote from IGN. And so here is our final quote.
Its improvements over the original are too numerous to list.
Name one. Name one improvement over the original. The only thing you can really name that's an improvement over the original that's bone dead obvious is weapon swapping with the D-pad. And at this point, I think you could just mod that into the original at some point. Other than weapon swapping on the D-pad, I cannot think of a single improvement this game has over the original. But they are too numerous to name. There's just way too many. It would take too much of IGN's precious time and space to name them. But let's see what he comes to here.
From simple quality of life changes,
D-pad weapon swapping. You know, that could have been patched into the original version of the game at this point. You didn't need to remake an entire game for that.
To completely overhauled boss fight mechanics.
That's what they're hanging their hat on, the boss fight mechanics of the game. So I didn't mention this before, but the boss fights of the remake, it's again that same stretching concept. So you start off fighting the boss how it was in the original, and then they add in this sort of like Bayonetta style phase to the boss fights. So you start off fighting the guy in the shed somewhat normally, and then by the end it goes Bayonetta mode and he flies into the air and he starts throwing support beams and explosive barrels in the air like an anime. I think the boss fights are definitely a downgrade over the original as well. Again, it just seems like a bunch of added filler, or because of the changes in the shot system where you can just walk around and shoot. It kind of throws off the feel of the boss fights anyway. Like the troll, you just walk around and shoot it. It's really not that interesting anymore. That's why you need to get the remake, even if it is worse in every other metric. So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Arnold, Alexander Pfeiffer, Alexander Talbot, Dingo, Another Joe, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Aaron Solis, Arrow Viper, Bo, Ben, Vito Dames, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Chase Palumbo, Chattel Maltese, Chris Yuzafovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Clammy Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksand666, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, Des Audio, Danchi, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, Delta Tango 6, Disco Star Slaya, DJ420, Praise It, Eric H, Fanticide, FCK, Francisco, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, Jake Ryan, JLab, JB RPG, John Kelly, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, Khalil Reedy, Contain, Praise the Boys, K Horse, Malaise, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Mechalin, Michael McCord, Mitchell Y, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Oakland Kugels, Philip Mason, Rattlecat, Raul, Real Skeen, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Sarah, Scanline City, Seesaw STG, Shmup Junkie, Sir Pong, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Super Funk, Tamzarian, Takero Mucho, The Boot Rex, Their Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tiram, Sugumo, 2IU, Twilight EX, Utakoi Roots, Vic Viper, Wabby Legs, X20 Specs, Boghog, and Utskaya. Thanks for watching.